Okay, yeah, we're live. All right, so basically, we're just gonna wait like a few seconds to basically just go about and wait for people to actually come on in. I'm just gonna quickly put any basically put out some notifications just to let people know that the stream has indeed started. Um, okay, there we go, and yeah. So okay, let's see if anyone's on at this point. Not yet. Okay, so yeah, I'll just quickly go about doing that. And you know what I'm gonna do? Let's get this started. Let's get this started. All right. So hello and welcome to the third the Canada Files news stream, which is focused on Canadian foreign policy. So today I am joined by two very special guests. I'm joined by Roger Clark of the Hassan Diab Support Committee and Daniel Z, along with Patricia of Investigate Philippines, and she will be coming on at 8:15. So basically, could I get, you know what, Daniel, could you start? Could you introduce yourself?
So my name is Daniel, and I'm a writer for the Canada Files. I've written a couple of articles, and my latest article is focused on the fundraising efforts to get medical supplies for Cuba by solidarity groups within Canada, and I hope to see it up soon. I am looking forward to seeing where Canada Files goes in 2021.
All right, thanks a ton. Now, Roger, you wanna go?
Sure. So my name is Roger Clark. I was for about a dozen years, I was the director of Amnesty International here in Canada, the English-speaking branch. I retired from that position at the end of 1999. But my activities over the last 4 or 5 years have been largely devoted to working on behalf of Hassan Diab. And I will get into his story, I guess, in a minute. But it is a major and a very long and rather sad story. And there was a milestone today, which is, I guess, why I'm here now. It's because in Paris, there was a decision by a French appeal court to send Hassan to trial. And the significance of that will become evident as I talk about it a bit more.
All right, sure thing. And so I'm obviously the editor-in-chief of the Canada Files, formerly involved with the NDP, not involved there anymore. And I was a student organizer during high school against education cuts in Ontario. So, as Roger alluded to, basically, now obviously Hassan Diab may not be a name familiar to most people. So now he was obviously wrongly accused by France of involvement in the 1980 Rue Copernic attack. So can you first just take us through basically how Hassan's ordeal basically they began?
Sure, yeah. Hassan was born in Lebanon, and he studied there. He studied at the University of Beirut, studied sociology, and eventually made his way to North America. He studied at Syracuse University, where he obtained his PhD. But by then he was also interested in becoming a Canadian citizen, and he moved to Canada in 1993 and became a Canadian citizen a couple of years later. As you said, Aidan, the story really goes back 40 years. It's hard to imagine, but the story is that long. And in October of 1980, there was a huge bomb explosion outside a synagogue in the Rue Copernic in the heart of Paris. It's a very Jewish quarter, and a lot of the interpretation at the time was that this was an anti-Semite attack, that it was deliberately targeted that way. And it was a very destructive attack. 4 people died and almost 40 people were injured. Most of those were people who were just coming out of the synagogue at the time. So you can imagine that there was horror and great determination by the police, the security forces, and by the French government officials to find out who was responsible. This was considered to be the first deadly attack on a Jewish institution in France since the Second World War. So it was very big, and it was very important that the perpetrator or perpetrators be found. And even today, that is still very true. Now, what happened in those early years there were police investigations, of course. There was a ruined motorcycle that was part of the explosion. The assumption was that the bomb was placed in the side saddle of the motorbike. So there was some evidence there. And after a lot of hunting around, it was determined that the person who owned the bike had signed into a hotel in Paris and had stayed there a couple of nights, giving a false name. It was a Greek Cypriot name, Alexander Panadriou, and had filled in a visitor's card. In those days, if you stayed at a French hotel, you were obliged to fill in a card with your name and occupation and so on. It was sort of a regular process. Anyway, they found this hotel card and began examining it. They didn't know where this, it was a false name, I should say as well. There was actually nobody by that name in existence. But nevertheless, the police pursued their investigation, and they looked at the handwriting on the card, and this will become really very important later in the process. They also examined it for fingerprints and determined that there were no fingerprints on the card. And that too is part of the story later on. However, it really didn't go much further than that. They did find the bill of a purchase at a hardware store that seemed to coincide with the same person. They interviewed 1 or 2 people, and they tried to build up a sort of a robot portrait of the individual. And he was variously described as a man in his 40s, but beyond that, not a lot of real detail. I should add that Hassan Diab, at the time, in fact, was 26 years old. So already there were major questions as to why, what the identity was and why Hassan Diab later became considered as a suspect. So that's sort of the beginning. And then things really went quiet. I would say for almost 20 years, the investigations kept on going, but really turned up nothing at all. There were various theories about a Palestinian terrorist group that had carried out attacks in Munich and other places, but really there was nothing very solid. And in 1999, there were various rumors going around about secret intelligence. To this day, we don't know where that secret intelligence came from. This is, again, an important legal point, because secret intelligence cannot be used in a criminal trial. It can be used to find out other things, but you cannot use the secret intelligence itself. But the name Hassan Diab began to surface in some of the chat that was going on between the French Secret Service, I think the Germans, possibly the Israelis. But in any case, the name Diab came up, and a journalist working in Paris, a man by the name of Jean Chichizola, who worked at the time and still works for the Figaro newspaper in Paris, generally considered a rather right-of-center newspaper. He came to Canada, having discovered somehow with information provided to him from we don't know where, but he came to Canada and found Hassan Diab, indeed, a man called Hassan Diab, working as a university professor here in Ottawa. And on that basis alone, he confronted him one day as Hassan was coming out of his class and said, do you know that the police in Paris are looking for you? You're accused of being a terrorist. And Hassan was, well, as you can imagine, was shocked and surprised and said, well, it must be a case of mistaken identity because I wasn't there in Paris in 1980 at that time. Am I going too fast here? Are you okay? Shall I continue the story, or do you want to ask any questions?
No, go forward. This is a really important story, and I'm glad you're telling it. So
okay, good, thanks. Yeah, so the name Hassan Diab then began to circulate more. It was boosted by the discovery in 1999 that a number of years earlier, I think in 1981, a passport had been seized at Rome airport. Somebody was carrying a bunch of passports in a suitcase heading for Algeria. And among the passports, there were some that were fake and there were others that were genuine. One of those genuine passports turned out to belong to Hassan Diab. This also did not really go very far because clearly Hassan Diab had lost his own passport back in the civil war in Beirut, and not surprisingly had got another passport since then. The assumption is that the passport had been bought or sold, or in any case was on its way to some group in Algeria at the time. But it seemed to sort of confirm that there was indeed Hassan Diab who was traveling around and using the passport and so forth. From there, we need to jump another, I say up until 2007. In 2007, this was when the journalist from the Figaro confronted Hassan in Ottawa. At that time, the RCMP became involved at the request of the French authorities. So the RCMP began following Hassan. And really, it's described by Hassan himself as a very uncomfortable period. Nothing really was happening, no charges, he wasn't arrested, but the RCMP were following him around. But eventually it led to his arrest. And at the request of the French authorities, Hassan was arrested in November of 2008. And this was the beginning of a formal request for his extradition to France. Now, the extradition process is very complicated. It goes through many stages, but it starts with the submission of a file from the requesting country, in this case, France, which is the sort of like the dossier. It's called the record of the case. And all the supposed evidence, the charges, etc., all supposed to be contained in that record of the case. So it was on that basis. Now, Hassan was arrested, as I say, but after 4 months, he was released on bail. I only mention this because it shows the cruelty with which this case has proceeded. Hassan was released on bail. He'd been held in the Ottawa Detention Center, which is a notoriously bad place. It's a very shocking sort of place, very violent at times. In any case, he was released on bail. The conditions were that he had to post, I think it was $750,000 in money as a guarantee that he would not flee the country. He had to wear a security bracelet, an electronic bracelet around his ankle, for which he had to pay himself. Believe it or not, this still shocks many people. He was paying $2,000 a month for the privilege, in quotation marks, of wearing a security bracelet around his ankle. He could not leave his home. He could leave once a week in order to I think, check in at the local RCMP office, but he couldn't go anywhere unless he was accompanied either by his wife or by one of the people who had posted the money for him. So this was a very difficult period. The file that was submitted really contained two elements that are really quite important. The first one is this so-called handwriting evidence. And this takes us back to the famous hotel card of 1980. France, when the extradition trial began in Ottawa, France produced two statements by handwriting experts in which they said they had examined the writing on the card, even though it was in block capitals, so we can't even call it handwriting. And they had both come to the conclusion that the writing was indeed that of Hassan Diab. Now, to their great embarrassment, it turned out during the evidence, the production of the evidence, that they had indeed compared the block letters on the card with some handwriting that they said was that of Hassan. It turned out that, in fact, they compared the handwriting on a university application form from the University of Syracuse and came to the conclusion it was the same. Sadly, the form had been filled in by Hassan's wife. So what they were doing was comparing the handwriting of a woman, not Hassan at all, and had come to the conclusion that it was Hassan's writing. So the whole thing was discredited. The two reports, the two handwriting reports were discredited, and eventually the French lawyers, the prosecution, withdrew that handwriting evidence and said that they would submit a third expert's opinion. And they did that. There was a third expert, a woman by the name of Bisotti, and she wrote a report, an analysis of the handwriting, but which really did not come to any final conclusion. It said that there might be, it was couched in probabilities and so forth. So it really, it was a big part of the case, however, because there was nothing else. I mentioned the secret intelligence, but the secret intelligence, nobody could cross-examine it. Nobody could ask for witnesses. It was really on the basis of hearsay. So the secret intelligence information was really had to be set aside. It couldn't be part of the extradition justification. The whole case had been put together by an investigating judge in France by the name of Trevedic. And Marc Trevedic was well known in French circles as being a very effective anti-terrorist investigator. He prided himself on bringing to justice people accused of terrorism. And so the fact that Trevedic was involved in this case was a bit of a warning signal that this was not going to be easy, that whatever evidence could be brought forward would be brought forward. However, the extradition hearing was not very satisfactory. To rebut the handwriting evidence of Madame Bisotti, Hassan's lawyers produced analysis by three international handwriting experts, one from Canada, one from the US, and one from the UK. And all three absolutely demolished the Bisotti report, said that it was not reliable, that it was based on faulty so-called scientific analysis, and so on. So again, major questions. However, in spite of this, the judge, the extradition judge, a man by the name of Maranger, came to the conclusion that there was certainly a lot of evidence provided, but he felt that it was shaky, that it was weak, that he called it convoluted at one point. But he said that because France and Canada have signed an extradition treaty between the two countries, and that at that time, really an extradition could take place almost at the hearsay of the country asking. It wasn't automatic, but it was felt in legal circles that if a country asked for the extradition of somebody, the chances were that it would happen, and that the whole legal process, evidence, presentation of witnesses, cross-examination, all of that was really set aside and was not part of the process. So in the end, and this came, I think, in mid-2014, the extradition judge Méranger said that he was going to recommend that Hassan Diab be extradited to France. There followed a number of appeals at various stages. It even went as far as the Canadian Supreme Court. The Canadian Supreme Court felt that it was not appropriate for it to hear the case and refused to hear it. At that point, the decision was made, and within 24 hours, Hassan was on a plane from Montreal to Paris, and he arrived in Paris on I think the 14th of November 2014, and was immediately put in a high security prison just on the outskirts of Paris. It's a prison called Fleury-Mérogis. It's one of the biggest prisons actually in Europe, and a very uncomfortable sort of place. And that's where Hassan spent the next 14 months, 3 years and 2 months, more than 14 months, 38 months. He was in solitary confinement for much of that time, was allowed out of his cell for some sort of exercise, maybe 20 minutes a day, maybe half an hour a day. At times was denied books even, depended which block he was in and who was supervising the block. But in any case, what was wrong with this, apart from the conditions and the fact that he should never have gone in the first place, was that he was never charged. He arrived in France, and rather than charge him formally or bring him to trial or any of those things which would have been expected, all that happened was that he was made to appear before an investigating judge, was asked questions, but the investigating judge then set about pursuing the investigation. And effectively, that's what went on for the next 3 years and 2 months. Now, at various points within that time, the investigating judge, in fact, there were 2 of them by now, recommended that Hassan be released on bail. They felt that the evidence was not strong and that therefore there was no reason, at least not to give him bail. And on one occasion, they did release him. He was in Paris. He stayed with a friend for 2 days. And then they realized that they had made a mistake and picked him up again and put him back. This happened 5 times over the period of 3 years. And in the other 4 times, the recommendation of bail was turned down. He was not released. And in fact, nothing changed at all. Now, the big breakthrough came when there were 2 new investigative judges assigned to the case. The old one, Trevedic, the one I mentioned, he was replaced by 2 investigating judges, also from the anti-terrorist judiciary, a man by Herbeau and another one by the name of Fitzer. Anyway, they took this very seriously. They traveled to Lebanon because one of the things that Hassan said very early on was that he was not in Paris, he was not in France at the time of the October 1980 attack. In fact, he said that he had been studying for his exams in Beirut and that there were people in Beirut who could testify to that. And so the French investigating judge traveled twice to Beirut, interviewed university officials, interviewed a number of students who were contemporaries of Hassan's, and came to the conclusion that there was solid evidence that Hassan indeed was where he said he was in Beirut at the time of the October 1980 bomb attack. So the evidence was accumulating. there was nothing new coming out of all this. This is the sort of shocking part of this investigation. But eventually in January of 2018, so we're getting closer to where we are now, in January of that year, the two investigating judges produced a final report saying that they had found no clear evidence that Hassan Diab was guilty of the attack. That what evidence there was not convincing, and that there were major questions left unanswered, including the handwriting, of course, that was still there, but also including the alibis provided that he was in Lebanon at the time. And so on the 14th of November, they recommended that Hassan be released. That was a Friday, I believe, and he was released that same day. His lawyers picked him up from the prison, and 2 days later, he traveled back to Canada.
So can I just jump in? Can I just jump in quickly? I want to ask now. You said you basically had gotten involved a few years ago with Hassan's case, and you mentioned obviously your previous role with Amnesty International, which I think definitely is going to be something we get to. But like, how did you end up getting involved? Basically, I'm curious about that.
Okay, it's a very good question, actually. I got a phone call one evening from a guy that I knew a little bit. I'd known him from some of the sort of human rights work that I'd done, but I didn't know him so very well. But he said he'd been talking to Alex Neve. Alex Neve was the man who succeeded me after I left Amnesty when I retired. My job was taken over by Alex, and Alex was a friend of this other man, Colin. And Alex had suggested to Colin that maybe if he gave me a call, I could be persuaded to come out of my comfortable retirement and become an activist working with them on Hassan's case. And that's pretty much as it happened. Colin called me, said, and I'd known a little bit about the case, not a lot. It had been in the newspapers, of course. But that same evening, I went to a meeting of the Hassan Diab support group or committee. And that's history. That was about 5 years ago. And I've stayed with them ever since. The group is fairly small. It's probably somewhere between 15 and 20 regular people, meaning people that meet almost on a weekly basis, either in person or through a Zoom call as it is now, but people who are immensely active. There is a bigger network of supporters of Hassan that stretches not only right across Canada, but abroad, including in France, in the UK, and in the States as well. There are a number of supporters in the United States. So I would say the number of named supporters, people that we could count on if we wanted to submit a petition, for example, or if we needed to do some fundraising because legal fees were beginning to mount up. These were people we could count on, and we can still count on them, but I would say they number somewhere between
step out a bit.
2,000 and 3,000.
Sorry if I interrupted.
No, sorry. Do you have a question, Daniel?
I just think I need to step out a bit because I need to get something to eat right now.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Daniel, just put that through the chat next time, okay?
Okay.
All right, sounds no worries. Okay. Anyways, you're saying?
Yeah. So so I would say between 2,000 and 3,000 people are part of the wider Hassan Diab network. The smaller group, as I say, is largely Ottawa-based. A few people in Toronto, Kingston, and Vancouver. That's essentially it. And then a lot of allies within the civil society movements, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, which is based here in Ottawa, the BC Civil Liberties Group, Amnesty, of course, the unions, the Canadian Association of University Teachers has been very supportive from very early on. What I didn't mention was that when Hassan was first arrested by the RCMP, there was a complaint made to Carleton University about him. And the complaint was along the lines of, how can you allow somebody like this to be teaching students at Carleton University? And I still shudder when I think that by the next day, Hassan had lost his job and had been fired from Carleton. That was unforgivable. It was he was targeted, and the group targeting him knew very well what they were doing. They were sympathetic with the people in France who were families of the victims of the bomb, etc., and so on. So, you know, there's sort of some understanding of that, but nevertheless, it was a vicious attack that was unjustified and without any basis. But it did mean that Hassan lost his job. So the Canadian Association of University Teachers, perhaps partly because of that, became a very strong organization in support of Hassan. CUPE and the Canadian Postal Workers Union, they've been particularly strong over the years, could always be counted on to make statements and to, come to press conferences and speak out and so forth. So it's been very heartwarming to see that level of support from civil society and other human rights groups. And that continues today, of course. So Hassan returns to Canada. This is now, we're in January 2021. So already 3 years have gone by and there has been no change. Investigations, so-called, have continued in France to no avail. Nothing more has come up. The prosecutor in France appealed against Hassan's release in 2018, in early 2018. His appeal was investigated and was heard, but it was put off a couple of times. There was no conclusion reached, although one of the appeal courts in 2019, I think it was, may have been late 2018, asked for yet another handwriting report because it was clear that the earlier handwriting reports were inconclusive. So asked for yet another, in fact, 2 more reports. They were produced, but with no change. If anything, they confirmed the original finding that there was, in fact, no scientific evidence based on the handwriting that could convict Hassan in court of law. I mentioned early on the question of the fingerprints on the hotel card and the fact that the police in Paris at that time said that there were no usable fingerprints or no fingerprints at all as far as they could determine. Later in 2007, in fact, the investigation in France discovered that there were fingerprints on the card. They were at least machine readable. They were also able to find palm prints that had been on a vehicle in Paris at that time that was somewhat associated with the whole case. But in both instances, the palm prints and the fingerprints showed that it was not Hassan. They didn't match at all. And so the evidence had crumbled completely. And unfortunately, some of this evidence was not provided to the defense, to Hassan's lawyers, nor was it provided to the extradition court. So I say that only because the determination really is not only that there was no evidence, what little evidence there was confirmed Hassan's innocence. It was what they call exculpatory evidence, in fact. The last little piece, and I'll bring this to a close, after Hassan's return, Prime Minister Trudeau was interviewed in June of 2018 about Hassan's case. And Trudeau said at the time that it was very shocking that it was a terrible experience for Hassan and his family, and he promised that this would never happen again. Those were his words. However, the never again has not resulted in any real changes at all. And one of the consequences is that today, because the prosecution in France has maintained its appeals against the decision of early 2018, finally, the appeal judge gave his ruling today that Hassan should stand trial. Now, we haven't seen the written arguments that the judge produced. We'll be very interested to see them, because unless he came up with some other evidence, all he can do is repeat the evidence that has already been discredited. And so we don't know where it goes from here. What we do know is that Hassan does stand the risk of being brought to trial in France. Not that he would go in person, I think that's out of the question. And this will take a period of time. Hassan's lawyers in Paris have appealed today's decision. So that goes to what is called the Cour de Cassation, which is the French equivalent of our Supreme Court. So that process is likely to take, according to the lawyers, between a year and a half. As of today. When we get to that point in a year and a half time, a number of possibilities, of course. The Supreme Court in France, the Cour de Cassation, could reject the prosecutor's appeal, and that would be the end of the case. Or they could uphold his appeal and indeed say that Hassan must stand trial. A trial date would be set. Hassan would not attend. Clearly, why would he? The trial might be continued in absentia. I'm speculating entirely here because nobody really knows, but the outside possibility is that he could be found guilty by a French court and sentenced. And then what? Does France then proceed to ask for his extradition again? How would Canada react in the face of that? I think you get a good sense as I've been talking.
Yeah.
The nonsense, the utter nonsense of this case, and I would say the cruelty. I mean, Hassan, he's in his 60s now. He's married. He has 2 fairly young children at home. He's got a part-time teaching job back, but he has this dreadful cloud hanging over him with no resolution. There was a sort of hope among some of us that today's decision would say, no, that's it, no more. The prosecution appeal is refused. Hassan is declared innocent, and that's the end of it. But no, the French are determined to find somebody guilty of that 1980 bombing, and they have nobody else. The only person they have is Hassan Diab. And so they will do whatever is necessary to do to find him guilty, or at least to find a court that will sentence him. They're under great pressure. There are organizations that I would, I guess, hesitate to describe as right-wing, but that's probably as good a description as any. Some of them associated with extreme Zionist positions, and they are extremely active. They have lawyers who have standing in the case and who can also bring appeals and can argue the case. I mean, they do that. There are sympathetic journalists who will print the lies that they give. The sad thing is that in all through this, the real perpetrator of that bombing has never been found, has never been brought to justice. And which means that the families of the victims indeed have not found justice. They've found a scapegoat, and it seems that for some of them that's enough. But in point of fact, they have got an innocent person who is being persecuted and who is suffering. I have to say, I mean, he's doing quite well and he's got a lot of good friends and support around him. But at the same time, you can only imagine what he is going through and what today was like for him and what the future looks like going forward. So this has been a sort of a sad day, really, in a long and sad history.
For sure, I can absolutely understand that. So when did you and the crew realize that you're gonna need to basically put on this press conference, and how do you basically think that it went?
Okay, yeah. So we had a meeting of the local support group last Friday evening. We knew that a decision was coming very soon. In fact, we knew that it was going to be on the 27th today. The challenge for us was to decide how best to proceed. We didn't know which way the challenge would go. We didn't know whether it was going to be positive or negative. So we couldn't sort of prepare that really in advance. We could prepare for both scenarios. But the main thing at that point, I think, was to decide how important it was to react to what was happening and to not just let it occur. So the decision was made on Friday evening last that we would hold a Zoom-based press conference. We worked through the weekend. We put out a media advisory on Monday, which had to be translated into French because to get these things circulated effectively, they should be in both languages. Luckily, in many years ago, in a different life, I taught French at post-secondary level. So these things tend to fall on my lap when they come. But I do that fine. It's one of the things I can offer to the group. So we worked through that. We got it out, and I think it went extremely well. In fact, it lasted about 45 minutes. Questions were asked by half a dozen journalists, notably from CBC, Radio-Canada, Agence France Presse was there. I don't think they asked a question. CTV. So this was very positive, the reaction and the interest particularly. And throughout today, since this morning's press conference, there have been numerous other interviews, including this one. I guess, somebody got in touch with you from a mutual friend, Judy Deutsch. And so that led to that. And I'm really happy to be doing this. I know that we get good coverage very often in the mainstream media. We have a journalist working with CBC who has done really amazing work in research and so on, and has got to know the Diab family quite well. So there are very sympathetic journalists. And the big question, though, is, okay, so where do we go from here? What are the next steps that are possible, given that we're facing quite a long timeline, for one thing? And Hassan, of course, is facing increasing legal costs in France. And I don't know if you're aware, but Hassan has also initiated a civil suit against the Canadian government because of his wrongful extradition. So there is a civil suit going on in Canada. It's been sort of sitting there for a while now, but that will take a bit of time. We don't know how that will work its way out, but we have to be somewhat careful. We don't want to say things that will prejudice the civil case that's going on. That's one reason why Hassan himself has not been doing any media interviews at this time. So although there have been numerous requests through today, we decided, and in fact Hassan's Canadian lawyers decided that they did not want him speaking at this point in time because of the other case. But that really doesn't affect what we're doing. It doesn't affect what needs to happen. Our view, by and large, and this came out in the press conference today, is that Canada owes it to Hassan, supported by the Prime Minister's remarks in June of 2018, to notify the French, to bring to the French authorities their feeling that this case is not only is not going anywhere, but that it is accumulating the injustice and the unfairness that has been the mark of the whole thing from the beginning. It's difficult because governments don't generally involve themselves in legal cases, particularly if the legal case is in another country. But nevertheless, we feel that for somebody to be in solitary confinement in a foreign prison for over 3 years is a black mark on the Canadian record. And so part of what we will do from here forward is to try to bring greater pressure on the Canadian authorities to express to France their dismay that the case has dragged on this far and has not been resolved. I think that will be important. The other thing that we've started work on and that we will pursue fairly actively is to persuade Canada, the Canadian government, to begin a process of reforming the Canada Extradition Act. The Act, as you will have guessed throughout my comments, has shown itself to be flawed, has not provided the support for a Canadian citizen who was facing extradition, does not allow for evidence to be produced and cross-examined, allows evidence to be produced by the foreign country, and again, without cross-examination, the courts in Canada cannot insist that a judge in France come to Canada to provide evidence in person, so on. So there are many, many aspects. But the worst thing is the assumption that if a country asks for somebody to be extradited from Canada, it's likely to happen. In well over 90% of the cases, the person ends up being extradited. And I think lawyers who are experts in extradition law have absolutely no doubt that the time is well past for Canada to begin a serious re-examination, a rewriting of the Extradition Act. And so our energy will be partly in that direction as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to ask a question. There's two I have, but I guess I want to ask the first one, since you brought up the Extradition Act. Now, obviously, I listened to the press conference, and so basically, I know this probably wouldn't be applied retroactively, but in terms of the Meng case there, do you see similarities?
Not really. I don't. Other than the fact that both of them fall under the Extradition Act, but really the circumstances of Meng's detention and the process and so on is very different. The sort of accusations are very different. The fact that Meng is not a Canadian citizen, the fact that there are political elements to it, including the intervention from the United States in the case. Apparently, it was made clear that the United States was very interested in getting a positive decision on her extradition. So, although it's difficult to say that they overlap, I don't think they really do. In my mind, the situation is extremely difficult. The fact that Meng has to wear an electronic bracelet around her ankle seems to be a case of almost a cause for pride on her part. She doesn't hesitate to show it to journalists who are following her during her bail. She's asking for looser bail conditions, as I understand it, and they may well be granted, family visits and so on. And she's a very wealthy woman. Not that that has anything to do with the legality and the justice issue, but maybe it does. Maybe people with resources actually end up doing a little better and surviving the process a little better as well. But beyond that, I would say not.
That's fair. That's a fair question.
Can I ask the next question?
Yeah, sure.
So, during your discussion about the Hassan trial and the fact that, so I've heard it, and while I was listening, I've actually done some research on the Hassan case while I was listening to your story to keep myself up to speed, since this was the first time I've been aware of this issue. And what I noticed is that while there are, you can say the cases aren't really different. The cases may be different between Hassan and Meng Wanzhou. I say there is a link, in my opinion. It's tied to the fact that in both these cases, Canada simply regardless of whether the legality of this is genuinely justified or not, Canada simply basically a country that Canada's allied with, like France and the US, they simply knock on Canada's door and says, look, this guy is under an arrest warrant. You need to put him here until we can arrange for the extradition, even if the evidence pointing towards this the extradition, the charges that are being laid are really dubious. Are really dubious, and I think that if say, for instance, take if Canada, if Edward Snowden or Julian Assange were hiding in Canada, and the U.S. says give us the prisoners, then Canada would simply just give up the whistle. Simply give up the whistle blowers, regardless of whether the charges against them were just or not. And to me, this reflects a sort of failure in foreign policy failure with regards to our leadership. We simply allow these other countries to go into Canada and basically search, basically drag out people that they have issues with and make them stand trial, even if the charges or the evidence laid against them are really vague or even outright vague, dubious, or even outright misguided. So my question is, do you see a push to perhaps reform the Extradition Act as maybe tied to foreign policy reform, because it goes to a theme we talked about in the Canada files, that the lack of an independent foreign policy, that we don't really consider the facts of foreign policy issue or the bigger picture. We simply if someone we're allied with says something, even if we don't consider the fact, we just simply bend over and just allow them to do what they want. So I'm wondering if the reforms Extradition Act can be framed within the greater context of Canada's lack of an independent foreign policy, and reforming the Extradition Act can be tied to fighting for a more independent foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting question. There's no doubt in my mind that the nature of the foreign policy relations do play a part in whether an extradition process is engaged or not, whether the arrest takes place quickly, and so on, what circumstances. But having said that, the one hope about the Extradition Act, and particularly if we are able to bring about its reform, is that it does have a genuine legal standing. And behind that is the Canadian Charter of Rights. All of those things are realities that do play out. Now, having said that, though, I would agree with you that the way that this actually functions gives us the appearance that the process of getting somebody out is more or less just a question of one country asking another and saying, okay, we'll provide you with a file, but then everything will be all right. There's a sort of a story, I think it's only a story, that among extradition defense lawyers, the big question facing the extradition judge is whether the prisoner wants to have a window seat or an aisle seat, and meaning that extradition is going to take place, but really there's not a lot of serious decision making other than where he's going to sit or she's going to sit on the plane out of Canada. It's a very sad reflection on our legal process that in fact that can happen. And I have no doubt at all that the political elements that lurk behind the extradition requests and the extradition process do play a significant role. There's no question at all. As I think I was trying to say, in France, there is a very, very strong political lobby, in this case, aiming to have Hassan condemned and found guilty and put in prison for 20 years or whatever the penalty would be. That is a reality of politics in France. And there's no question that today's decision this morning was probably driven, I would say, more than 90% by the political reality in Paris. And the fact that in France right now, terrorism is a big issue. It has been since the big attacks in Paris 5 years ago on Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine. There is a strong anti-Islamic feeling in France at this time. There is a strong Zionist lobby in France, also at work. And France is not immune to the same sort of extreme right-wing politics that we can detect certainly in the States and certainly probably to some degree in Canada as well. So all of those have a role to play. And I think you're right, Daniel, that in the case of Canada's relations, for example, with the United States, which are always touted as very close and friendly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the extradition process is very close to being automatic, that it's sufficient for a country that is a so-called friend to make the request and the extradition will be granted. If it's a foreign country that is not a friend, then there's a different state of affairs, and that can play out in the opposite way. In the case of France, it's sort of a bit ambiguous and further complicated because the French have a different legal system as well. The whole theory of French legal process is based on a very different sort of base than the Canadian one. But ultimately, it still comes back to the question of justice and fairness. And luckily, there are people, including people in government. I should say, in fairness, that when Hassan was ultimately able to travel back to Canada, there was considerable help granted by foreign affairs people, individuals, but including the minister at the time, who was Minister Freeland. Everything was done to facilitate his speedy return to Canada. He was accompanied by an embassy official all the way, who traveled with him on the plane to make sure that things did not go badly for him at any point. So there are good people as well, and part of our challenge as activists and as lobbyists and as human rights workers is to identify where some of those allies can be found within the official system of things. So, you know, it's of course it's a horrible story. It really is, and I'm very glad to be able to tell it in some detail. We don't often get the chance to talk so extensively about it. But part of the lesson is that, as you were saying, Daniel, I think that it's way past time to reform Canada's Extradition Act. Whether that would make a difference now, in hindsight, obviously not. But at least it would mean that there were no more cases like that of Hassan Diab.
Yeah,
Totally.
sure. I just wanted to jump in here because there's a question from the audience. Now, I think this might be more addressed to you, Roger. So, is extradition generally a guarantee of conviction? And this is from Canadian Glen 1.
Okay, no, it's an excellent question. The Extradition Act, if you read it carefully, suggests that people are extradited from Canada to another country to face trial. The first point being that they are not extradited to face investigation. And this was the first sort of really major, egregious side of Hassan's case. He was sent to Paris, he was put in prison, but the investigation into his case, the search for evidence against him, continued for 3 years. Extradition does not mean, though, that there is a guarantee that the trial will take place or that the person will be found guilty. It means only that in normal, well, let me say, not use the word normal, but in expected situations, a person extradited would normally be charged officially upon arrival in the foreign country, might well be detained for further investigation of evidence and so on. That's not against the spirit of the Extradition Act. What is against the spirit of the Act, though, is to put somebody in prison without charge and with only investigation continuing. But in answer to the question, no, extradition does not mean that a person is going to be found guilty. It would normally mean that the person is going to face trial.
All right. Thank you, Tana. Okay. So luckily, Canadian Glen, actually one of the questions they had, you actually dug into it pretty well. So now I want to kind of go based on your experience. Now you said you were basically, to be correct now, you're saying you're the head of Canada International Amnesty International, correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So you have quite a breadth of experience then to draw on. So have you seen any somewhat similar cases to this, or has this been a rather unique one for you?
In my own experience, and I did quite a lot of research investigations in various countries around the world, but never one, to my recollection, that involved anything to do with extradition. So this was really something quite new to me. I was more familiar with people being held in solitary confinement and people being held without facing trial, administrative detention it was sometimes called, or simply locking people up and throwing away the key. So it's been a learning experience for me, an interesting one because I'm not a lawyer. I was never trained as a lawyer, but I've learned a great deal in the last 5 years about how the law works and how it can be applied and how it can be misapplied. I think that's the other side of that. But we're very fortunate. You listened to Hassan's lawyer, Don Bain, talking today during the press conference. He is a remarkable lawyer. He has done all of this work for Hassan pro bono. So he has worked as Hassan's lawyer very effectively indeed for the last 12 years. I can't say enough about the qualities that Don Bain has brought to this whole case. He has been well looked after from the legal point of view. lawyers in France, I'm sure, are very good as well, but they're also expensive. There's no free ride with the French lawyers. So this is another thing. This is what I was sort of getting at a little earlier when we were talking about the comparisons with the Meng Wanzhou case. Hassan is not a wealthy man, and so justice, as we know in many cases, not only in this one, sometimes eludes those who don't have the means to defend themselves sufficiently, cannot pay for a good lawyer. We see it all the time, and I don't need to spell that out to you. You know this as well as I do.
All right, so I want to ask a question to kind of give a bit of a transition. Now, did you do any, basically, I assume you did work related to human rights abuses in the Philippines. Would that be correct?
I never traveled to the Philippines. I knew some of the Amnesty people who were from Philippines. I got to know them. I have to admit their names escape me now. This was more than 20 years ago, and very often it was a meeting at an international meeting. But my recollection is that Amnesty International in the Philippines was in fact at that time, and I'm talking about the 90s, the 1990s, and maybe into the early 2000s, it was a pretty vibrant group. And there were some members of Amnesty Philippines who served on the international board, for example. Again, the names escape me, but yeah, I did know some, but I never visited the Philippines. Closest I got, I think, was Cambodia. I did a couple of research investigation trips to Cambodia in 1991 and again in 1993, at a time when the Khmer Rouge were just beginning to disappear from the scene, but not entirely. It was a time of transition, and unfortunately, what we saw then has transpired that the country has really fallen deeply under essentially what is an autocracy, a dictatorship. It's not a happy place, and it wasn't then.
All right, so I asked that question, I asked that transition because we have yet another special guest. It is Patricia Lisson. So Patricia, could you introduce yourself to the audience? Oh, wait a second. Yep.
Oh, there I go.
There we go.
Go.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, my name is Patricia Lisson, and I'm the chairperson for the International Coalition of Human Rights in the Philippines, Canada. And I'm also the chairperson for Quebec and a member of the Global Council for ICHRP and part of the investigative team in Investigate PH, which is a global investigation of human rights situation in the Philippines. ICHRP Canada's interest, ICHRP globally, and ICHRP Canada is interested in exploring the human rights situation in the Philippines and working for a just peace in the Philippines. So that's kind of where I'm sitting at the moment.
All right, terrific. So thank you for coming on. So now there, you obviously mentioned Investigate PH. Now, let's say someone's never basically heard of this campaign before. Could you basically break down what's going to be done and what's the case? Why does action need to be taken?
Okay, I think it's important to start with why we're doing it. I mean, that would be just to kind of put it in context. The human rights situation in the Philippines has been deteriorating or has never really improved since Marcos, maybe a little bit there in the middle before we get into the current situation with the Duterte government. But in 2019, the United Nations Human Rights Council was dealing with a resolution, and that resolution called for the let me get the right name here, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Micheline
Bachelet?
I get the right name here, sorry, names aren't my forte, to do an investigation and write a report. And she did that, and it was presented to the UN. Council in June of last year, 2020. And then that was dealt with over the summer months. And of course, in September, towards the end of September, first part of October of 2020, the report was dealt with, and an outcome of that report was presented to the floor of the UN. And that presentation and addressing Barcelet's report, which was very comprehensive, very well done, and a report that she had to do outside of the UN, outside of the Philippines, because the Philippine government wouldn't let her in to do the report face to face with folks. She pointed out in that report the terrible situation in the Philippines, highlighting red tagging, political prisoners, the war on drugs, all of those aspects of the situation, and also highlighted very clearly and very carefully the lack of internal mechanisms within the country to actually deal with these situations. For example, if somebody was a political prisoner, was in prison and came to court, there wasn't a proper system to deal with it. Or someone was killed, a political prisoner was killed, human rights activists were killed. There hasn't been and is not currently a proper mechanism to deal with that fairly and within this understanding of the rule of law. She highlighted this. So this is not us highlighting, this is her. We would agree with her, concur with her findings. Those of us who have been working with human rights in the Philippines fully and extensively. So with all that very strong report that came from her to the UN, what actually then transpired after that was a very weak report from our view. And the report said that they would give technical assistance and capacity building to the Philippine government. Those of us engaged in human rights situation, not only in the Philippines, but those looking in from around the world, Amnesty International, for example, would say that that was a pretty weak response to that very extensive report. And so out of that, we felt, we being iChirp Global, in consolidation with a number of other civil society groups, that this just wasn't acceptable. And so we began this process of creating the Investigate PH with the goal of returning back to the I'm going to get the right numbers here, the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council, which meets in mid-March, to present a preliminary report. And then again in the 47th Council, which is in June, and then again for the final report that comes in the end of September, which is considered the 48th. And we want to bring to that court and have Barcelet present again to the floor the severity of the human rights situation in the Philippines, with recommendation, strong recommendation for action against the Philippine government at this time. I guess the secondary goal, and it's always there, is to bring to the world stage just how terrible and horrendous the situation is in the Philippines. And this situation in the Philippines is not the only place around the world that we're finding this. And I don't need to, I'll probably go into all of that, but by highlighting this particular case, I think we're opening the door for other cases to come forward as well, and support those that are already there on the floor, because there's many there that will be talked about too in those sessions. Is that helpful, or should I go on with that?
No, it's I do have a question for Daniel, actually. So now you've done some writing on Canada's relation to the Philippines. Now, obviously, I'll ask Patricia for more, but can you talk about what you've written about on this subject in terms of Canada's relation to the Philippines?
So what I've written on the subject is just going to. So what I've written on the subject is basically I focused on the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines petition E2820 with the House of comments, and we focused on the relationship between Canadian government and mining companies with the Filipino government. We called the petition called on Canada to cease all sales of military equipment to the Duterte government and to end defense cooperation with the country. And the country is particularly in response to the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines by the President Duterte. And we also, in the petition, in the article I wrote, I also noted that the ICHR petition expressed concerns about the violence linked to Canadian mining companies in the Philippines. For instance, on April the 6th, 2020, 100 members of the Philippine National Police dispersed 29 primarily indigenous Iflango, I don't know how to pronounce it, Iflango residents, forming a barricade to protest the continued operation at the Didipio mine by the Canadian-Australian company Oceana Gold and Oceana Gold, and we basically called on these recommendations. The petition called on the Canadian. The petition called me these recommendations.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, Daniel. Yep. Okay. So now, Patricia, basically, in terms of, let's say, Canadian complicity in this, now Daniel detailed some of the article stuff he wrote about. I obviously assume there's far more connections than can be covered in 2 articles. Can you speak a bit more to what Daniel may not have hit on in terms of Canada's connection? And this can be long-term, short-term. It's up to you there.
Well, I mean, thank you, Daniel. I didn't see your article, but it's a really important aspect of the Canadian government's complicity in the human rights situation in the Philippines is certainly there, no question, through a variety of sources. Certainly, the Canadian mining practices do not support or help the human rights situation. The Oceana Gold is an Australia/Canadian company, the Didipio mine, and they of late have, well, it's a complicated situation, but the Canadian law does not regulate the mining companies who operate outside of Canada, so they can operate in impunity. So they're not held accountable for their actions outside of the country. And so this is a really important and serious thing to raise forward. ICHR Canada, in conjunction with Mining Watch Canada, submitted a petition to the House of Commons on this very issue, asking for an ombudsperson to be appointed for the Canadian government to appoint an ombudsperson to deal with the extraction industry and give that position some legal teeth so that they can hear these cases, bring in evidence from outside of the country, and really deal with the situation of the mining industry in the Philippines. As far as the sale of arms, we also entered into a letter writing campaign and lobbying our MPs on the wholesale of Bell helicopters to the Philippines, which were then used to bomb their own people, as far as we can figure out, particularly in Mindanao, which is the southern part of the Philippines, bombing the indigenous schools, the Lumad schools, which have been now pretty much closed down, and that was the beginning of the closure of those schools, with selling military helicopters. When we contacted GAC and talked to the foreign affairs people, they said, well, we do not sell, our military arms are not to be used against the country's own population. And so by forcing and talking about this a bit, we were able to stall the contract. So they aren't selling anymore currently to the Philippines, probably other places, but they're not selling to the Philippines. But yet that contract is kind of on the back burner. Is that helpful? And
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So I wanted to ask basically now, in terms of the campaign, I'm going to ask about the launch itself, but I want to ask first, something that interested me now, the main Canadian one who's kind of going to be taking a lot of the burden is from the United Church of Canada.
Mhm.
Now, I believe it was, I just want to make sure I'm not getting his name wrong, but I believe it was, am I correct in saying it was Reverend Michael Blair?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, good. So now I'm wondering, what was the process of getting the UCC on board with this investigation?
Well, I'm a United Church minister. Actually, my title is
Okay.
Patricia. Listen, that's part of the reason we get them on board. No, part of them, they are members of the iChurch Canada coalition. It wasn't a big deal. I shouldn't say a big deal. I don't mean it that way, but because of the United Church of Canada has a long history engaging in civil society issues, we call it social justice issues within our community. And certainly the United Church is not new to that discussion or argument, and have been involved in many cases of this nature. But the United Church has a long history in the Philippines. And I'm a little hesitant to say this because it's always a positive relationship either. We used to send missionaries in the old way to the Philippines, all in good faith, but sometimes not doing the right things. And we recognize that and have apologized for some of the situation we may have caused. But that relationship in the Philippines has continued over 40 years or more, to the point where we have partners in the Philippines. Their order of ministry people come to Canada and work in our churches, and our people go there. So we're in a work relationship. So it wasn't a big stretch when we asked them to be a part of this investigation.
For sure, for sure. Now, I guess then I would shift to basically asking about the launch. Now, I believe obviously there's the Canadian launch, which I believe was yesterday morning, and there's the Australian launch, which was I think it was at 7.
Where it was, I just finished. We just finished it.
Okay. Okay, that's what it was. Silly me. Okay, yeah. So obviously there's the 2 events recently, but in terms of the Canadian event currently, now, could you maybe take people through the events there? Obviously there's one particularly thing which kind of gave me a bit of a connection there, which, I mean, obviously the cause itself is connection enough to be engaged and be focused, but there was a really kind of beautiful song in tribute to some of those killed in the war on drugs. But in terms of the event itself, could you go through that and give people a sense of it? Because, some people might not have been able to catch it.
No, I'm sure. The launch, you mean?
Yes, the launch.
Why we did the launch? Well, it was intended to be a media launch. So we were hoping, and we did attract a media, both in the launch yesterday and the one that just finished, which is in Australia today, where it was hosted out of. And so our intent was to try and bring to the public, to the broader Canadian population, North America and United States are very heavily involved in this as well. Europe, we have chapters in the UK and in Europe and France and Germany. I think we have one in Italy and Spain. And so as to pull those together and to say, here, this is what we're doing, and try to explain why we're doing what we're doing, how important it is. And so to do that, we brought in High Commission. So in this process of investigation, there's 2 or 3 levels of people working at different parts of this. The High Commissioners, of which you heard 4 of them yesterday, are the face of the investigation. And they're the folks who will take the word forward for us. And they're all fairly well connected in either civil society and lawyers groups, union labor groups, church groups, all of the broader community. And so, and the point is to introduce them to the broader community, to to show that this is an international investigation, non-Filipino. And it was kind of a weird thing for me to say, oh, we can't invite Filipinos to be a part of this, but we wanted to be independent and seem to be non-biased. So if one can be non-biased, but you know, it's done from an arm's length from the country. So that's what our goal was. The bringing the witnesses in was to really show that what we're doing is listening to the people who are being most affected, to the poor, to those human rights defenders, to church workers, when we've had a number of order of ministry people killed, or priests or ministers, if you will, pastors, lawyers, so to tell the real story, that we're not making this up. This is not some political discussion in ivory towers. This is real people with real concerns and are being affected by a government that is failing them. And in fact, I would use the term, and not to sound too dramatic, but a government that's engaged in war in its own people. And so that's the purpose. And so the cultural event where we had Sina sharing her song is written by a young woman who was just killed in, I believe it was in August, time flies. And she was a human rights defender in Negros, the island of Negros. And she's a person that those of us who have been to the Philippines and been on a number of these visit numbers of communities know her and have heard her story. And so that was she did Sina, the woman who wrote the song, did a very great, particularly good job of tying her story together. She really told the story of Zara and what the work she'd been doing before she was killed. And Zara is one of many of the human rights defenders who have been killed. Just in the last time I was in the Philippines was in 2019, and since then 30 or 40 human rights defenders have been killed and put in prison. And that's not to mention all those who've been killed in the war on drugs, which is the other witness that showed up about talking about her two sons who were killed because they were accused of a part of this whole war on drugs, which we know which is just total murder of people, and the effect that has had on families and the whole society, in fact.
You know, I actually do have a question there, because I think it's obviously when you have a war on drugs like that, I think there's obviously a societal issue there. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what was like kind of what laid the groundwork for the war on drugs, because it's something truly horrific, right? And you'd assume, quite frankly, that something like that doesn't tend to just accidentally happen. So well, I'm just wondering if you could break that down.
Well, I can a little bit. That's not really I haven't really looked carefully as much as I have on the other issues, but the war on drugs is modeled after the war on drugs in the United States, if we remember, and I can't remember the president, was it
Reagan, I think.
Reagan, that's what I was trying to think of his name, psychological block. President Reagan and his war on drugs. And the same thing happened, from what I'm familiar with, and my colleagues in the States who do community work, the same thing was happening. People were shot and killed and families destroyed just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe they were involved in drugs. I'm sure there is a drug trade in the Philippines, as there is in Canada, as there was in the United States. But does it require a war on drugs? When I was in the Philippines and met with the woman who shared, the witness, her name is Pasco, she was sharing her story. She's a part of a movement called Rise Up. And I met with that group when I was there in 2019. And when you hear their stories, it's some of the people, like she admitted that her sons were involved in some kind of drug, but do we shoot them down in the streets? Is that the way we deal with this? But many of the people are not done. And it is in the way it was described when I was listening to the stories, it's a war on young men. Many of these people killed are young men. And a war on when you take away the men out of the picture, who might be the breadwinners, what does that do to the families that are left, or so on and so forth. So there is a really good movie done, and I'm great at giving you the name of the movie, but I can't tell you who the producer is, but it's called Nightcrawlers, and it is a filmmaker who followed behind the police and these killers who hit on poor communities for the war on drugs. It is quite hard to watch, but it is, whoa, it gives you a chilling picture of what's happening this was in Manila. I don't know if any of you have been to Manila, but Manila is a huge city, and the level of poverty is quite outstanding. And so when you see these guys moving around these communities, pretty scary stuff.
For sure, and I thank you for doing your best to provide a little bit of a perspective there. So now I'm also curious, because this was an international campaign, the second event now, that was centered around Australia. Now I'm curious, because you mentioned there's multiple chapters around Europe. Why the focus in Australia?
Well, Australia has a chapter, and the chairperson of the global ITRIP committee is Peter Murphy, and he lives in Australia. And on the High Commission, where's my list of names? On the High Commission, we have a number of Australians. Leanne Renon, who was a former senator of Australia. And there's another, let me see if I can find her name. I've forgotten her name now. There's another woman who's a member of the Greens Party, and she's on the High Commission, and she's from Australia. Janet Rice, and she's a senator from Australia, in the sitting senator in the Australian government for the Greens Party. And so there's quite a large movement of people interested. Don't forget, Australia is very close to the Philippines, and Australia deals with a large number of migrant Filipino workers. So I'm sure that's part of it as well, but also just interested people in human rights situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I really do appreciate you kind of filling us in there. So I wanted to mention something which I assume you're all aware of, basically, but there's a pretty national campaign in Canada on the U.S. and Saudi-led war on Yemen. Now, I did a video basically kind of breaking down what was happening, the direct action there. And so basically that direct action now was to block a Hamilton transporting company called, I think it was, I'll get the name in a bit, I can quickly get it, but they were blocking that company. And that company actually sells, transports, not sells, but it transports tanks, which have been used very actively in the war on Yemen. Basically to the Saudis themselves. I believe it was, okay. If you just give me a quick second, I should be able to, there we go. Padlocks Transport International. It is Padlocks Transport International. And so that was one of the things there. It was a great campaign. Daniel, I want to ask for your thoughts, basically, about the direct action taken by these activists, and your thoughts basically, on Canada's support for this war.
I'll admit I haven't been following that direct action specifically, but I did cover War is Not Essential demonstration way back last summer by the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. I think they occupied some people occupied the arms plant that were put in Oshawa that was producing, I think, weapons for Saudi Arabia. But like, I will say that looking at Canada's relationship with the Duterte government and the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and looking at what I learned when I attended that demonstration in the summer online, I believe that what we see here is that we see with regards to our foreign policy a very convenient lie that's being used, lie that the Canadian government never meant for these governments, for Saudi Arabia to mass murder people in the Yemen, or never meant for, as discussed by Patricia, never meant for Duterte to bomb indigenous villages with helicopters. But like, basically, but the thing is, like, this excuse doesn't hold water. Like, at the end of the day, Canada's still complicit. They facilitated the arms trade to Saudi Arabia, and they facilitated the arms trade to the Philippines. And when they're confronted, they basically said, no, that's not how we intended it. This personally, I think, reflects on the fact that the Canadian government is like making deals with these regimes and engaging human rights violations, whether in Yemen or in the Philippines, against their own populations or against other populations. It really reflects a really morally bankrupt foreign policy, in which basically the Canadian government will just do these things without any concern where the arms laid off. But when they're confronted with the actions, they either make the excuse that, oh, like, if we don't like sell these arms, the workers will be out of a job. Like, the alternative is, why don't we just convert the arms factories to things that don't produce arms? The fact that we can just convert the arms factories to something that don't produce weapons for these countries engaging in human rights violations never gets into the head of the Canadian government. And the other excuse being, of course, that they never meant for it to be used against these populations. It really highlights like how we need to really push for a reassessment of the ties that Canada has to the rest of the other countries that engage in diplomatic deals with, specifically with regards to the arms trade.
Daniel, I think we're losing you a bit there, voice-wise.
Anyways, that's my 2 cents on this.
Thank you. Yeah. I think just to talk about arms race and the Canadian government, when we pushed back, we being iChirp Canada and the United Church of Canada, because they also were engaged in a letter writing campaign to the federal government on the sale of Bell helicopters to the Philippines. They did pull back. So you're quite correct. They kind of are walking on both sides of the street at the same time. But the lobby for arms production, of course, is a very powerful voice, and there's a lot of money changing hands. So our government has a statement that says, and maybe Daniel knows it, or the other gentleman, that there's a line in the whole business production that that the government produced, that goes something like this: we will not produce arms, like you were saying, Daniel, we will not produce arms to be used as to kill mass people, or do something like that effect. And it's kind of a crazy statement, because then why are you selling the arms in the first place? What are people going to do with military arms? I mean, if you're shipping military weapons, guns and helicopters, what are people doing with them? Most likely killing somebody or about to kill people. So
yeah, for sure. I totally get what you're saying there. So yeah, basically, I guess I would want to ask basically for your thoughts, Roger, because you would obviously, I think, have quite a grasp, basically, given your role at Amnesty International Canada, basically, even if maybe you weren't directly basically going to there at certain points.
Well, I was listening to Patricia with great interest, because certainly in my years with Amnesty, which, as I say, ended really in 1999 when Alex Neve took over from me. But the arms trade at that point was big. It wasn't always Canada, it was the international arms trade. And I had quite a lot to do with the situation in Central Africa. I visited Rwanda a number of times and remember a major confrontation that we had with Paul Kagame, who at that point had not yet become president, but was the power there, and sitting across a table. And he began to yell at us. We were a small delegation of 3, but Amnesty had intervened in South Africa to stop South Africa selling arms to some of the Central African countries, and notably to Rwanda, and notably helicopters and so on. So it was a major issue in Africa at that time. There was also quite a lot of research done about countries, particularly I think Russia at that time, and other countries in the East that were shipping arms, flying arms in by plane into Zaire, as it was, what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, but flights going into Goma, which we were able to track. And so I was impressed, and I still am impressed by the sort of coalitions that the churches and other rights organizations have been able to build. As I say, I don't remember the people that I knew in the Philippines at that time, but certainly there were many instances. I'm thinking actually of more Central America, where the churches were very vigorous and were really leading the way in the human rights coalition building process, which to my mind is one of the both the successes and a little bit of a failure in recent times, that some organizations, and I would include Amnesty there, have become rather decentralized in a way that has not been necessarily very productive. The words are good. The idea of building coalitions on the ground is extremely important, but it also falls foul sometimes of other interests, and including the political ones. I do have a question, though, Patricia, if I might, from what you know, the effect of COVID-19 in many countries, particularly the poorer countries, has been, well, nothing short of tragic. And when I hear stories that are coming out of India and out of some of the very poor countries, I just can't imagine. But the problem, one of the problems behind that is the impact on law and order, so-called law and order issues, that in the name of fighting the pandemic, in fact, the things that Patricia was talking about and that we know about in the Philippines already under Duterte and so on, can happen more, more subtly, more surreptitiously, that can even, pass for something else. Is that the case? I mean, what do you know about the situation now?
Well, it's been horrendous. You've described it quite well in lots of ways. But I think something particular in the Philippines, no, I must admit I haven't followed all the other countries, so I can't say that they haven't done some of this too. But 2 things. One is the anti-terror law, which was brought out the lockdown came most of the world in March. Duterte introduced this new law in April. And this law is against his own people. This is not looking at terrorists from outside of the country. This is a law that will charge, for example, our human rights defenders as anti-terrorists. And this was implicated, can you imagine, written and put into place and put in force during the pandemic, and has been used as a very forceful tool to raid. In fact, we were just talking about a raid in the island of Kenai, of 13 people, 7 of, I think 7, don't quote the numbers, but I think 7 were killed, and the other people were put in jail. And anyway, it goes on and on. It's a very sad story under this anti-terror law. So the other point that I would like to raise is that the Duterte himself, I don't know if you ever watch any of his newscasts, but in his speech to the public, to the country, is he said, if they don't follow the law, just shoot them. This is a public statement on public TV, and part of his speech to the nation, I guess you call it. And you know, if people don't follow the rules of the pandemic, just shoot them. No questions asked. The thing, and so the food, of course, is a problem. Jobs, unemployment is a problem. People can't travel. As I said, if you've been to Manila, it's a huge city with really bad public transit, and people spend hours getting back and forth to work. So that's all kind of gone to, excuse the expression, hell in a handbasket. And it's just a terrible situation all the way around. And so, yeah, and we know that governments, fascist related governments or styles of government, fascist styles of government, if you will, use a disaster like the pandemic to further their own cause, and to remove people from public office and to militarize the civil service is what he's been doing over the years. And that's only been enhanced during the pandemic.
Where are the, sorry, could I ask another question, Aidan? Where's the strength in the human rights movement inside the Philippines? Where do you see signs of hope, or do you see signs of hope? Where are the allies? How are the defenders surviving? I mean, I know that many are not. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Church still carries a lot of public support, which is kind of hard to imagine. The hope is in the people themselves, in their tenacity, in their willingness to take the risk, to stand up and speak out against this horrific situation that they find themselves in. We work with particular groups, Equivoice, Ibon, Karapatan, Rise Up, Gabriella, which is a women's group. And there's a whole list of which I can't think of all the names, and we work through our, and so does iChurch, work through the church network. And so we work with the, what's it called? United Church of Christ in the Philippines, the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, all of those places. And people are working incredibly hard to bring to have their stories heard, and the support they've offered to victims of this. The United Church of Christ in the Philippines in Davao have opened up their compound and have received over 500 internal refugees of Lumads, indigenous peoples who've been pushed off their land. And they've been dealing with these people in this compound. It's not very big for 500 people, and have supported them through those. So that's the hope. I mean, the willingness to come together, the willingness to stand together and to take the risk.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you basically for the definitely very valuable question there. So I want to ask like a bit of a more of a, I guess I would say maybe a fun question to you, Roger. So basically, in terms of Amnesty International Canada, how did you actually get involved with Amnesty International?
Not sure that's a fun question, but
oh, well, yeah, no, I know, but I mean more like you went and did something.
I'm kidding as well. It goes back. I lived in Newfoundland for a number of years. I was teaching French at Memorial University up until the mid to late 80s. But increasingly, my research work was actually into 18th century thought. And 18th century thought stands out largely because it was the cradle of a lot of the human rights principles and a lot of the ideas that we have today about liberty and rights and so on. Not that they didn't have their own problems, but still, a lot of the thinking of the Enlightenment was really important, and it shaped me in a number of ways. But I also began to get a little weary of that, and I got weary of the academic world, and increasingly was involved in the local amnesty group. So in the early 1980s, I was active there. I was responsible for our local and eventually the national work in Southern Africa. So that was it. And then in 1987, the chance came to actually apply for a full-time job with Amnesty Canada. And I did, and that was, the rest is sort of history, as they say. But to answer your question at a sort of deeper level, I mean, I was a child of the Second World War. I grew up, I was born just before the Second World War, and I grew up knowing what the consequences of war are and feeling them very directly. These were the years also of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, of the Suez Crisis, and moving a little further up in 1968, where I was a student in Paris. And Paris in 1968 was a very exciting place to be in many ways. It was a time when the student revolt was taking place, but it was much deeper. And although I was on the fringes of it, but I lived there for 2 years nevertheless, and so it became close. So a combination of factors, both personal, psychological, but more particularly the realization that Amnesty was able to achieve things and was able to talk to particularly young people. I think that was one of the exciting things of my years when I was the Secretary General of Amnesty, that we were able to reach out to a lot of the youth in Canada, putting on big concerts, human rights concerts and so on. They were very successful, and that has gone on. I mean, the youth sector is vibrant and is still a very powerful force within the organization. I don't know, Patricia, whether you've met Alex Neve. I imagine you know of him anyway. He's just retired as well, actually. We have a third, in my mind, not the third. We have a recent new Secretary General in Canada, whose name is Keti Nivyabandi. She is from Burundi and is known as a women's rights activist, a human rights activist in Burundi, a very fine person. And I've yet to meet her. She's only been in post a couple of months. But she will do well. But but I think that my international experience, and I did quite a number of research investigation missions to many places, including Cambodia and Central Africa and Northern and Algeria and so forth. But realizing that the coalitions and the human rights defenders' work was really among the most important things that we could undertake. And it was a really great satisfaction to me personally to be a little bit part of that. And even within Canada, the work that the coalitions that we were able to build with the church groups and with many of the others, it was always good. It was good work, and there were good people. In the Hassan Diab case, we've got a number of very strong allies within the Unitarian Church, and they have done remarkable things in terms of their own engagement, but also in being able to bring on board other people. So I'm not sure if that's the fun answer you wanted, but in any case, that's sort of a little bit of my story.
No, it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting for sure. Patricia, I guess since we're on the theme, basically with iChirp, now, how did you get involved?
Oh dear, see, it's a long story. Well, I got involved I've been involved in the Philippines. I'm a church person, so I knew about the Philippine story when I was quite young, because we would hear stories from our returning, I hate to use that term, missionaries or church workers come back and would share the stories. And so I always found it fascinating. But during the 70s, when I was first in theology, some of the first political activist work that I did was against the Marcos government. And in the United Church and in the ecumenical movement, we have what we call the 10 Days for World Development. And we would deal with different issues. And one of the years it was the Philippines, and we had a speaker come from the Philippines. And so that sort of started it all off. And that same speaker, I won't even say the number of years ago, is now a friend of ours here in Montreal. So it would come full circle and meeting up again after all those years. But that's really how I got involved in this. But I've been involved in justice issues all of my life, most of my life, and mostly Canadian issues. And I'm a street worker and an organizer, community organizer. So I've done a lot of work in poverty issues here in Canada. But again, my first activist work has been around South Africa. Well, actually, I go back to Namibia. I hate to tell you how old I am. Southern Africa, South Africa, and then the Philippines and so on. And I've always had my finger in the thing. So iChirp came along because I was invited to go for an exposure tour to the Philippines, 2013, I think. And then from then, continued to stay involved. And then iChirp Canada just came into being in 2019. So we're a new coalition. But many members of that coalition have been doing Philippine works for years, a number of years.
All right. Well, thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Roger. I think at this point we're past 9 o'clock, so we might call it to an end for this one. But basically, yeah, thank you, Roger, for telling the important story of Hassan Diab and what's happening in his case. Patricia, thank you for telling us all about the Investigate PH campaign. And Daniel, thank you for your great interventions on so many of the issues that we discussed, and obviously keep up the great work writing. We can't pause. I always do appreciate it. So
it's really
thank you, Aidan. Thank you so much, and good luck with this venture. I guess you're really building into this program that you're doing.
Anybody like to join us? We're open we can use all the help we can get.
Actually, Patricia, that's a great point. I want to give one opportunity now. Basically Roger and Patricia first, and then Danielle can go after. So would you two want to plug anything? Like, how can people get more involved with the organizations you're connected to? What kind of, like, in terms of maybe social media? What are the connections that potentially people can get to?
Well, for us in iChirp Canada, we have a website, so you could look at our website, contact any of the connections there, or call me or contact me, and then we can hook you in. What we would like to do, I mean, part of our goal is to use this as not only as the first goal, of course, is the human rights issue. Second is to expand our network across Canada, bringing the story to folks who've never heard the story and might be interested in being part of the story. So I would suggest, if you're interested, this is a good campaign. Well, I think all our campaigns are good, but we have many campaigns. We're working on different parts of the Philippines, political prisoners, the indigenous people, as well as Investigate PH. So we have, what do we have? We have a website, and we have a Facebook page, and yeah, however we're connected in social media. And that's not my forte, as you can see.
No problem.
But I think if you go type in iChirp Canada, our webpage comes up, and then from there, there's links to follow through. And Investigate PH has a website as well. Yeah.
Let me see if this is correct. Nope, sorry, that's the wrong site. Okay.
For Hassan Diab, if people who've been listening or who watch this are interested in Hassan's case, there is a website. I think quite a complete website. Go to Justice for Hassan Diab, and this will bring you right up to date on what we're doing. And the other thing that I mentioned, the idea of achieving some reform of Canada's Extradition Act, is something that we will be working hard on over the next 12 months. And so I just invite people to look out for that, look out through Twitter and Facebook and other social media. Things will be there, and we will be looking for support. And if I can be just a little bit pragmatic as well, if the opportunity comes up to contribute funds to Hassan Diab's legal defense, he is going to need it, believe me. There's been a lot of money raised over the years, but lawyers in Paris can send in a bill for $30,000 in a weekend almost. It's a little frightening, and that seems to be also the cost of some of the human rights work. It's not cheap, and it does need resources. And at this time, particularly with the world in a little bit of chaos, fundraising has become rather difficult. I'm sure Patricia can speak to that one as well. It's one of the toughest times for NGOs and civil rights organizations and justice and so on. So keep that in mind too. We need that support. Thank you. Thanks for that.
So Daniel, feel free to go on.
So, anything I should talk about?
Okay. Well, I mean, you have the Patreon, right? And okay, you know what? It's fine. Basically, so obviously Daniel has Twitter. Basically, it's let me see if I can get it here. It's twitter.com/ I think it is ZDaniel, right? Yeah, it's
Yes.
ZDaniel.
Anyways, yes. So you can. So I've linked my Patreon on the stream chat. I'll link it again. I'll link it again, and my Twitter is yes, Daniel. Yes.
Okay. Daniel, wait. Just something I had forgotten up until now. One last thing, and then we'll get out. The Cuba article. You mentioned you were working on an article. Can you maybe preview to people what that's about? Because that'll likely be coming out either tomorrow or at latest Friday.
So my upcoming article is. So my upcoming article is, which I haven't given it a title yet. I'll give it a title as soon as I can. It's about the Canadian Network on Cuba's event. The event that they hosted on Saturday, announcing the start of their medical supplies for Cuba campaign, seeks to raise money to help the Cubans who have done a really good job fighting the coronavirus with the healthcare system. It seeks to raise money to get them more medical supplies and more medical equipment, because with the U.S. blockade and the current uncertainty with U.S. and Cuba relations, since Trump is out, but we don't know if Biden will actually try to have another diplomatic reset. Or he might just walk back on that promise and just try to strangle the nation. So Cuba will need a lot of help from those in solidarity with it in order to allow it to continue developing the infrastructure to care for its own population and to provide the vaccine for not just Cubans, but for anyone around the world in need, in accordance to their medical internationalism and the efforts they've taken throughout the years in providing medical support to anyone around the world who need medical support and assistance, anyone around the world who need it. So, on Cuba to raise money to help the Cubans continue their fight against COVID. I've actually included a link on information regarding making a donation to the CNC with regards to providing the end of my article.
All right. Thank you for that, Daniel. I do appreciate that. And yeah, obviously, if people have the chance to support the efforts of the Canadian Network on Cuba, and I believe it's the Canadian Cuba Friendship Association as well, definitely take the chance and definitely try to do that. But yeah, so I think now we will come to an end. So basically, my Twitter is twitter.com/AidenJonah if you haven't seen that before. And so in terms of Facebook, it's just Aiden Jonah on Facebook. In terms of supporting my work and supporting the journalism that I'm doing, My Patreon is it's right up there in the chat. It's just patreon.com/AidanJonah. Obviously, the Canada Files website. Please do go check that out. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, that's there. It should pop up when you come onto the site. You'll never miss any of the Canada Files content. It'll be coming right through through your online mailbox. And yeah, final thing. Basically, obviously, for new viewers, please do follow for more news and some gaming streams as well. On Wednesday night, on Sunday night, sorry, I'll be having a Canada Files news stream at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be joined by Andre Goulet from Harbinger Media, from the Harbinger Podcast Network, Mecca Poetic, Lana on Twitter, who's a really cool writer and is a pretty well-known social media friend. She's written for, Lana's written for Passage before, obviously. And so that will be a very, very fun event on that date. And so basically, and Yosigun, who is a researcher for the Alberta Advantage podcast. So that is the extent of the guests that will be appearing there. And so basically, I hope people will definitely follow so you can make sure that you do not miss this. There's a ton to discuss, and I think it'll be quite the enjoyable stream. But yeah, so now, despite how much I have enjoyed this, and I think how much we've all had a chance to learn from our terrific guests, I think I will have to call it close. So one final time, basically, Roger, Patricia, Daniel, and to the chat as well, thank you so much for being a part of this. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.